It was just another busy afternoon at the hospital when Nurse Amy walked into room 207. The smell hit her first, a strange, sharp odor that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual hospital smell of antiseptic and clean linens. This was different. It was faint but unmistakable. She paused, looking around, her eyes settled on Mr. Daniels, an elderly man who had been in and out of the hospital for months now. He was asleep, lying peacefully in his bed. But something wasn't right. Nurse Amy's heart skipped a beat. She leaned in closer. The smell was stronger near him. But that wasn't all. She noticed yellow stains on his hospital gown, staining the fabric in a way she hadn't seen before. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her radio. "Code Blue," she whispered, her voice shaking, but determined. The alarm echoed in her head like a warning bell. Something was very wrong. Before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. Nurse Amy couldn't take her eyes off the yellow stains. She gently pulled back Mr. Daniels' covers, her heart racing. The stains were more than just dirt. It was something deeper, something that didn't belong. She glanced around the room, searching for any sign of what might have caused it. There was no obvious reason for the strange marks. The smell lingered in the air, filling her lungs with unease. But Nurse Amy wasn't one to panic. She had seen enough to know when something was wrong, and this felt very wrong. She pressed the button on the wall to call the doctor. Her voice was calm, but her mind raced. "Dr. Harris, I need you in room 207, now." Seconds ticked by like hours as she stood frozen, eyes locked on Mr. Daniels. His shallow breathing did nothing to ease her nerves. Within moments, Dr. Harris rushed into the room. He looked at Nurse Amy, his expression instantly turning serious as he noticed the yellow stains. "What happened?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I'm not sure," Nurse Amy replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I've never seen anything like this before. He smells strange, and these stains. They weren't here this morning." Dr. Harris knelt beside Mr. Daniels, checking his vitals. The machines beeped rhythmically, almost as if they were in tune with the building tension. Nurse Amy bit her lip, holding her breath as the doctor examined the patient. Was he going to be okay? Dr. Harris's brow furrowed as he gently pressed on Mr. Daniels' abdomen. The elderly man didn't react. He was still unconscious, but the doctor's hand was shaking slightly. Something wasn't adding up. The yellow stains were spreading. Dr. Harris quickly lifted the covers, revealing even more discoloration on Mr. Daniels' skin. His chest tightened as he understood what was happening. "This wasn't just a regular infection, Nurse Amy," Dr. Harris said quietly. "Get me a nurse from the ER. We need to transfer him immediately." Nurse Amy's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Was it too late? Her mind flashed to the worst possible outcome. She quickly left the room to find the nearest nurse, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. Nurse Amy grabbed the phone in the nurse's station, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. Her breath came in quick bursts. "I need an ambulance. We've got a patient with severe internal bleeding, and his condition is deteriorating fast." On the other end of the line, the dispatcher responded quickly, asking her questions she didn't have answers to. "What's the patient's name? How old is he? What is his current condition?" Amy could barely speak as she watched Dr. Harris work tirelessly on Mr. Daniels. The sound of the beeping monitors filled the air, a constant reminder of how quickly time was slipping away. As Nurse Amy waited for the ambulance to arrive, she noticed something strange. Mr. Daniels' breathing had slowed down, and the yellow stains were now more pronounced, as if something inside him was poisoning his body. Her mind raced. What was causing this? Could they fix it in time? The stench in the room was becoming unbearable. Her gut told her this wasn't just some routine hospital issue. She looked at Dr. Harris. His face was pale, and his brow was covered in sweat. He worked quickly, trying to stabilize Mr. Daniels, but Amy could see the fear in his eyes. This was bad. Really bad. The paramedics burst through the door, their boots thumping against the floor. They wasted no time. One paramedic took Mr. Daniels' vitals, while the other quickly gathered equipment. "Let's move him out," one paramedic said, his voice calm but urgent. Nurse Amy watched in a daze as they carefully lifted Mr. Daniels onto the stretcher. The yellow stains spread across his body like a map of an illness she didn't understand. She swallowed hard, feeling a sense of helplessness creeping up her throat, but she had to trust them. They had to save him. As the ambulance rushed toward the hospital, the siren screamed into the night. Nurse Amy sat in the back, watching Mr. Daniels' lifeless form. The once peaceful man now looked so fragile, as though he could slip away at any moment. The paramedics worked efficiently, but even they looked worried. One paramedic squeezed Amy's shoulder and gave her a small smile. It was meant to reassure her, but it only made her heart ache more. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Will Mr. Daniels survive this? She didn't know, but she knew one thing: they had to keep fighting. The emergency room doors slid open, and the paramedics rushed Mr. Daniels to an operating table. The doctors and nurses were ready, but Amy couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the end. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. The room was filled with frantic energy, machines whirred, people shouted instructions, and the smell of antiseptic was overwhelming. Dr. Harris stood over Mr. Daniels, his hands steady despite the growing chaos around him. Nurse Amy hovered nearby, watching in silence, her stomach in knots. The doctor scanned Mr. Daniels' vitals on the monitor, his face tight with concentration. "We need to figure out what's causing this internal bleeding," Dr. Harris muttered, barely audible over the beeping machines. He turned to the nurse standing by his side. "Get the lab results. I need to know what's in his system." Nurse Amy nodded and rushed to grab the necessary papers. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the frantic atmosphere. Every second counted now. As the minutes ticked by, the beeping of the monitor grew more erratic. Nurse Amy's hands were clammy as she returned with the lab results, handing them to Dr. Harris. He scanned them quickly, then paused, his eyes widening. It's poisoning," he said, his voice low. "But from what?" The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Poisoning. That was the last thing Nurse Amy expected. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. How could this have happened? Dr. Harris leaned in, his fingers tapping on the lab results. "We need to find out what type of poison. It could be anything. I'm going to administer an antidote, but it's a shot in the dark without more information." Amy watched helplessly as he injected Mr. Daniels with the antidote. The tension in the room was palpable, like the air itself was holding its breath. Every second felt like an eternity. Amy's eyes never left Mr. Daniels. She could hear the sound of the antidote dripping through the floor, the quiet hum of the machines working overtime. The next few minutes passed in agonizing silence. The team of doctors worked furiously, but there was nothing more they could do until the poison was identified. Amy stood in the corner of the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her mind raced. Where did the poison come from? How had it gotten into his system? It didn't make sense. Mr. Daniels had been fine earlier. The smell, the stains, the faint signs of poisoning, they all pointed to something that had been done deliberately. But who could do such a thing? And why? The waiting room outside the ER was filled with quiet murmurs. Amy's thoughts were interrupted by a nurse rushing into the room, holding a new set of test results. "Dr. Harris," she said urgently, "we got the results back. It's a rare toxin. It's from a type of chemical found in certain pesticides." The room froze. Pesticides. The thought was chilling. How had Mr. Daniels come into contact with something like that? Dr. Harris exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. A pesticide? That changes things. We need to know where it came from. Did he come into contact with anything unusual? Nurse Amy's heart skipped a beat. Could the source be something that was overlooked earlier? Could Mr. Daniels have been exposed while outside the hospital? The possibility gnawed at her. Her mind raced back to earlier in the day when she'd noticed that odd smell in his room. Was it possible that something had gotten into his system without anyone noticing? Suddenly, she had an idea. What if it was something in his food or drink? Amy quickly walked over to the nurse's station and grabbed the hospital's food delivery log. As she scanned it, her fingers trembled. He had received a meal delivered from a nearby restaurant just hours before his symptoms started. Amy wasted no time. She rushed to the hospital's kitchen to gather information on the meal that had been served to Mr. Daniels. As she spoke with the kitchen staff, she felt a surge of hope. If she could trace the source of the food, they might find out how the toxin entered his body. The head chef's face went pale when Amy asked about the food delivered that day. "We've had a few complaints about that vendor," he admitted quietly. "They've been using some cheap ingredients lately. But we never thought anything of it." Amy's stomach turned. This wasn't just a coincidence. It seemed more like a deliberate act. The vendor's food might have been contaminated. She rushed back to the ER, her mind racing. The key to saving Mr. Daniels might be linked to the food he ate. Back in the ER, Mr. Daniels' condition continued to deteriorate. His skin had turned pale, and his breathing was becoming shallow. The antidote hadn't worked fast enough, and the poisoning was spreading. Dr. Harris didn't look up as Amy entered the room. His focus was entirely on stabilizing Mr. Daniels, but Amy could see the worry in his eyes. The paramedics had done everything they could, but it was clear now that they were fighting a losing battle. The toxic chemical was slowly shutting down Mr. Daniels' organs. Amy felt helpless. They needed more time. They needed answers. Then, a thought struck her like a lightning bolt. The food. She had to act fast. Nurse Amy knew they needed more than just suspicions. She dashed to the hospital's records to check the vendor's history. What she found made her blood run cold. The restaurant had been flagged for serving contaminated food before. But no one had ever acted on it. She grabbed the phone and immediately called the police. "This is Nurse Amy from Mercy Hospital," she said urgently. "I need to report a poisoning case. It's linked to a food vendor." Her voice was steady, but inside, she was on fire with the need to help Mr. Daniels. This wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a criminal one. Amy hung up the phone and turned back to the ER. Was it too late to save him? Would Mr. Daniels survive this mystery poison? Only time would tell. The paramedics returned to the ER, bringing more equipment. But they weren't the only ones rushing against time. The police had arrived at the restaurant to investigate the food source. The clock was ticking, and with every passing second, Mr. Daniels' chances of survival grew slimmer. The minutes seemed to crawl by as Amy stood helplessly in the ER. Dr. Harris and his team continued working tirelessly to stabilize Mr. Daniels, but the situation was growing more dire by the second. Amy paced back and forth, her thoughts racing. What if they didn't find the poison's source in time? What if it was too late to save him? Suddenly, the door to the ER opened, and a police officer entered, his face grim. "We found something," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. The vendor, the food was indeed contaminated with a toxic chemical, but there's something strange. Amy's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" The officer took a deep breath, clearly hesitant. "The chemical used, it's not something you'd find in typical pesticides. This is something more sophisticated, something designed to cause harm." Amy's stomach twisted. A deliberate act of malice. As the officer continued to explain the nature of the toxin, Amy's mind raced. Why would anyone intentionally poison someone with such a dangerous chemical? And why Mr. Daniels? The officer explained that the chemical found in the food was a rare compound, one that could only be acquired from specific, controlled sources. It wasn't just something anyone could get their hands on. This wasn't a random act. The officer said, his voice growing more serious. Someone went out of their way to poison this man. Amy felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This was no accident. But who would do something like this, and why? The investigation into the vendor's food supply had only just begun, but the police were already closing in on possible suspects. Amy couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. She returned to Mr. Daniels' side, watching the steady beeping of his heart monitor. Every time the beeps slowed, her heart clenched with fear. He was fading. "We need more antidote," Dr. Harris said, his voice tight with stress. "This isn't enough. We need to counteract the poison before it reaches his organs." Amy quickly rushed to prepare another dose, her hands shaking with the weight of the moment. Was it too late to save him? But then, she remembered something. The smell. The odd, acrid odor she had noticed earlier, it had to mean something. She had to find the source. Was it possible the toxin wasn't just in the food? As Amy thought about the smell, another idea sparked in her mind. What if the toxin wasn't just in the food, but in something else Mr. Daniels had come into contact with? She ran over to the nearby nurse's station and pulled up the records of everything Mr. Daniels had been exposed to during his stay. The more she looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. There was a report on file from a few days earlier. It seemed like Mr. Daniels had been near a pesticide storage area outside the hospital while on a brief walk to get some fresh air. Could that be the missing piece? Amy's heart raced as she pieced the clues together. The strange smell, the yellow stains, the rapid onset of symptoms, it all seemed to point to one thing: Mr. Daniels had been exposed to a concentrated pesticide, possibly from the storage area, and somehow, it had entered his body. She rushed to Dr. Harris, her voice urgent. "I think I've figured it out. It wasn't the food. It was the pesticide storage area. He was exposed to the toxin when he walked outside the hospital." Dr. Harris looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You think the pesticide made its way into his system from the outside?" "That's possible." He turned back to the machines, monitoring Mr. Daniels' deteriorating condition. "We don't have much time. We need to get more specific treatment." Now, with the new information, the team moved with renewed urgency. The antidote they had been using wasn't enough to combat the specific type of pesticide poisoning that Mr. Daniels had suffered. The clock was ticking, and every second was crucial. Nurse Amy's mind raced as she prepared another set of treatment options. She knew she had to act quickly. They needed something more targeted, something to neutralize the pesticide in his system. Dr. Harris barked orders to the staff, and Amy could hear the rapid footsteps of the medical team as they scurried around the room, collecting the supplies they needed. The hospital had a special treatment for pesticide poisoning, but it had never been used in a case like this before. As the new treatment began to flow into Mr. Daniels' veins, the tension in the room was thick. Amy held her breath as she watched the machines. The antidote worked slowly, but steadily. Mr. Daniels' breathing started to steady, and the pallor of his skin began to soften. Amy exhaled sharply. Was it working? Could they save him? Minutes felt like hours, but slowly, the signs of life began to return. The beeping of the heart monitor quickened, and Mr. Daniels' face took on a healthier color. Amy stayed at Mr. Daniels' side as the effects of the antidote began to take hold. She couldn't let herself feel relief yet, not until he was fully stable. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the occasional shuffle of feet. Amy remained focused, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. It was a fight for survival, and for the first time since the poison had been discovered, Amy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they had done it. Just then, Mr. Daniels' eyes fluttered open, his gaze cloudy at first. He blinked a few times, disoriented. And then his eyes focused on Amy. "What happened?" he whispered, his voice weak. Amy smiled, her heart lifting. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "You've been poisoned, but we got to you in time. You're going to be fine." For the first time in what felt like forever, Amy allowed herself to believe it. The doctors were now confident that Mr. Daniels would make a full recovery. The toxin had been neutralized, and the antidote had done its job. As Amy sat beside him, she thought about everything that had happened. She had followed her instincts, put the pieces together, and saved a life. It wasn't just the science that saved him, it was the little details, the moments when she trusted her senses. As the sun set outside, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. This was why she loved being a nurse, because sometimes, you had the power to save a life when it seemed impossible. "Thank you," Mr. Daniels whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving me," Amy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "It's my job," she replied. "But I'm glad I could help." As Mr. Daniels slowly regained his strength, Amy couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. The investigation had confirmed the presence of the pesticide, but there was still so much left unanswered. Why had Mr. Daniels been exposed to such a dangerous substance in the first place? Who was responsible? The answers were out there. But she couldn't let herself get distracted. Mr. Daniels was alive, thankfully, but the shadows of doubt still lingered. She sat by his bedside as the night grew quiet. Would the authorities find the person behind this? Mr. Daniels had begun to show signs of recovery, but he was restless. His mind, though weakened, still wondered about what had happened. How did this happen? He asked again, his voice barely audible. Amy could sense the urgency in his question. It wasn't just the poison that troubled him, it was the idea of someone intentionally harming him. She leaned in closer, her voice soft yet firm. "We're still trying to figure that out," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But right now, what matters is that you're going to be okay." Mr. Daniels' eyes flickered with suspicion. "It wasn't just an accident, was it?" Amy hesitated. "No. It wasn't," he exhaled shakily, his mind clearly spinning. "Then I need to know who did this. I can't rest until I know." Amy could understand that need for closure. She wished she had the answers, but all she had was the growing sense that whoever had done this wasn't finished yet. And they might strike again. Days passed, and as Mr. Daniels regained his strength, his obsession with the case deepened. He insisted on speaking with the police every chance he got, urging them to hurry and find the person who had tried to end his life. Amy noticed a shift in his demeanor. He was no longer the man she had met just days before, the one who had been kind and polite. Now, he was a man driven by fear and suspicion. "What if they come after me again?" Mr. Daniels asked one morning, his voice tinged with panic. Amy tried to calm him. "You're safe here. You don't have to worry about that now. You've been through a lot. Just rest." But she could tell that the fear in his eyes wasn't something he could just shake off. The trauma of the poisoning had taken root in his mind. Meanwhile, the police had been working tirelessly, and they finally discovered a potential lead. The pesticide used in the poisoning was indeed rare, but not as rare as they'd thought. It had been purchased legally, but the trail went cold after that. "We're getting closer," the lead detective said, his voice grim. "But we need more time." Amy couldn't help but feel an edge of frustration. How could they take so long? Time was ticking, and there were so many unanswered questions. Then, a breakthrough came. One of the hospital staff members had seen a suspicious figure lurking near the pesticide storage area on the day Mr. Daniels had fallen ill. The figure had been wearing a hospital uniform but was never on the staff roster. Someone inside? Amy's stomach churned. A threat from within? The police had narrowed down their search to a few individuals who had access to the pesticide storage area. Among them was a nurse who had been working the night shift during the time of the poisoning. Amy's heart sank as she heard the name, Rebecca Dawson. She remembered Rebecca, an experienced nurse who had been quiet, professional, but always a little too eager to prove herself. Could it be that someone from the inside had poisoned Mr. Daniels? Could she be the one behind this? Amy asked herself, her voice barely a whisper. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. Rebecca had been seen near the pesticide storage area. She was one of the few with direct access to the chemicals. The investigation into Rebecca Dawson began in earnest. The more the police dug, the more troubling things became. Rebecca had been struggling financially and had recently faced personal issues that had made her life more chaotic than usual. Was this desperation driving her to do something drastic? Or had she been coerced into doing someone else's bidding? Amy couldn't deny the connection between Rebecca's struggles and the poison. But was she truly capable of committing such an act? The police began interviewing Rebecca, and as they pressed her further, she started to crack. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she admitted, her voice shaking with guilt. I thought it would be an easy way to get ahead. I didn't know it would go so far." Amy's heart pounded in her chest. Rebecca had been involved in the poisoning, but why? Rebecca's confession came with a chilling twist. She admitted to poisoning Mr. Daniels, but it wasn't personal. She had been bribed by someone else, someone she thought she could trust. Amy listened in stunned silence as Rebecca described how a mysterious figure had blackmailed her, threatening to expose her personal secrets unless she carried out the poisoning. She was a pawn in someone else's game. The person who had manipulated Rebecca was someone no one had suspected. It was someone close to Mr. Daniels, someone who had worked with him for years. I didn't know it was him. Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking with terror. But he told me I had to do it. Or else. The room fell silent as the detectives and Amy exchanged glances. Who could this person be? And why would they want to harm Mr. Daniels? The search for the mastermind behind the poisoning intensified. The true villain was finally revealed, and the truth shocked everyone to the core. It was none other than Mr. Daniels' business partner, someone he had trusted for years. It was all about money, the partner confessed, his voice cold and calculating. I wanted control of the company. He was in my way. Amy stood in disbelief as the gravity of the betrayal sank in. Money, power, those had been the driving forces behind the poisoning. In the end, justice was served. Mr. Daniels' business partner was arrested, and Rebecca was given a lighter sentence due to her cooperation. But the damage had been done. Amy left the hospital that day with a heavy heart. She had saved Mr. Daniels' life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was no happy ending when trust was shattered so deeply. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought in the silence of betrayal, Amy thought as she walked through the hospital doors. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and know that in life, we often face moments of confusion, fear, and even betrayal, moments that test our trust and belief in the goodness of others. But just like Amy, who saw the darkness and still chose to act, we too can find strength in the toughest of times. No matter how lost you feel or how deeply you've been hurt, you have the power to choose your next step. Like Rebecca, who was caught in a web of fear and pressure, we all have moments when we feel trapped. But remember, it's not the mistakes that define us, it's how we rise from them. The true strength lies in making the choice to do what's right, even when it's hard, even when the road ahead is unclear. Think about this, in every situation, you have the power to choose to trust, choose to act, and choose to make things better. So, ask yourself, when was the last time you chose to do the right thing? Even when it seemed impossible, remember, our actions today shape our tomorrow. Don't let fear or doubt stop you from choosing to be your best self. Your strength is stronger than you think.